They say betrayal hurts most when it comes from strangers, but what if it comes from your own blood? This is the story of a father who gave his whole life to his son, only to be robbed by the very hands he once taught to hold love. You know, sometimes life teaches you the harshest lessons through the people you love the most. I never thought I'd live to tell a story like this, a story of betrayal that didn't come from strangers, but from blood. It's about an old man, a father, who spent his entire life giving everything he had to his only son. And yet, when life turned its page, that very son robbed him of his peace, his dignity, and even his hard-earned savings, all to impress another man. Yes, you heard that right. His son stole from him to buy a car for his father-in-law. The story begins in a small, quiet town where life moves slowly, where mornings smell of rain-soaked earth and evenings end with the sound of crickets by the window. There lived an old man named Mr. Hahn, 73 years old, grey hair thin but neatly combed, his old jacket always buttoned up no matter the weather. He was a humble man, content with little things, a hot cup of tea, a walk to the market, a soft breeze after sunset. But behind that peaceful face was a man who had worked his bones dry to raise his son. He had only one child, David, the light of his life. Everything he did, every sacrifice, every hour of labor was for that boy. Mr. Hahn often said, "A parent's happiness isn't measured by money, but by how well their children live." And for a long time, he truly believed that. He worked construction for nearly 40 years, waking before sunrise, coming home long after dark, hands calloused and body aching. But when he saw little David run into his arms shouting, "Dad, you're home," the exhaustion melted away. He saved every coin, skipped his own needs, repaired torn shoes again and again, all to give his son a better chance at life. And he did. David studied hard, earned scholarships, landed a good job. Mr. Hahn couldn't have been prouder. When David got married, the father's heart swelled with pride and joy. He sold his wife's old gold chain just to help pay for the wedding. He wanted the best for his boy and for his daughter-in-law, whom he welcomed like family. He even gave David his car, an old silver sedan he'd saved for years to buy. "Take it, son," he said with a trembling smile. "Drive safe. It's not much, but it's yours now." David hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Dad. You've always done too much for me." Those words were everything. They were love, gratitude, hope. But with time, something in David began to change. He stopped calling as often. His visits became rare, shorter each time. When he did visit, he seemed distracted, impatient, like he had somewhere better to be. The warmth in his voice faded, replaced with indifference. Mr. Hahn noticed. Of course he did, but he didn't say anything. Parents are good at hiding heartbreak. They tell themselves it's just life, that children grow busy, that love doesn't disappear, it just grows quiet. Then came the day everything fell apart. Mr. Hahn went to the bank to check his savings. He had around $12,000, money he had carefully set aside from his pension, his small part-time jobs, and years of discipline. It was his safety net, his peace of mind, his last protection against the loneliness of old age. When the teller pulled up his account, her expression changed. "Sir," she said gently, "your account has been emptied." He blinked, confused. "That can't be right. There must be a mistake." The teller turned the screen toward him. "It shows 2 withdrawals by your son, David Hahn. He said it was for your medical treatment." Mr. Hahn laughed softly, bewildered. "Medical treatment? But I'm not sick." The teller looked down, uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, sir." He walked home in silence. Each step felt heavier than the last. His mind kept repeating one thing: there must be an explanation. That evening, he called David. His voice trembled. "Son, I went to the bank today. They said you withdrew $12,000. Why?" There was a long pause, and then David's voice. casual and tired. "Dad, it's not what you think. I needed to help my father-in-law. He's been struggling." "Your father-in-law?" the old man asked. "With my money?" David sighed. "He's family too now. You always told me to be kind, to help people. That's what I did." The irony stung. "Helping others doesn't mean taking what isn't yours," Mr. Hahn said softly. But David's tone hardened. "Dad, it's just money. You don't even use it. You live alone. You barely spend anything. Just money." Those words echoed in his chest like a cold wind. That night, he sat by the window, staring out into the dark street. "It's just money," he whispered to himself. "But it was my peace, my security, the only thing keeping me from needing anyone." He opened the drawer next to his bed and found a small envelope. Inside was a $50 bill and a note written in his son's hurried handwriting. "Dad, here's some money for groceries. I'll send more soon." He smiled sadly. $50, that's what I'm worth now. Days later, his neighbor, Mrs. Lee, stopped by with a bag of apples. "Uncle Hahn, you look pale. Are you all right?" she asked kindly. He forced a smile. "Just old age, I suppose." She chatted warmly for a while, and then mentioned something that froze him in place. "I saw your son the other day. He looked so happy driving a new car. Said his father-in-law gave it to him. A new car." His heart dropped. That night, sitting in silence, he whispered, "His father-in-law gave it to him." And suddenly, it all made sense. The next morning, he went to see David. The shiny black car was parked right outside the house, gleaming under the Sunday. Mr. Hahn stood there for a while, staring at it, before knocking on the door. David opened it. Surprised. "Dad, you didn't tell me you were coming." "I just wanted to see you," the old man said, his eyes glancing back at the car. "That's new, isn't it?" David hesitated. "Yeah, it's from my father-in-law." Mr. Hahn looked at him, the faintest smile on his face. "Really?" David swallowed hard, his eyes darting away. "Tell me, son," he said gently. "Did you buy that car with my savings?" David froze. Silence filled the space between them. Then he snapped. "Fine, yes, okay, I used your money, but I had to." "You don't understand, Dad. Her family looks down on me. I had to prove myself." The old man's voice was calm, too calm. "Prove yourself? By stealing from me?" David turned away, guilt and anger mixed in his tone. "You wouldn't understand. Things are different now." "Mr." Hahn nodded slowly. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't understand anymore." And with that, he turned and left. He walked down the street slowly, shoulders heavy, eyes empty. The world seemed dimmer than before. He whispered to himself, "Maybe I failed as a father. Maybe I gave too much. Or maybe I never taught him that love doesn't mean taking everything." That night, he couldn't eat. He just sat outside, looking at the stars. He used to tell David when he was a boy, "See that one? That's our star. It'll always shine for us." But now, even the stars felt cold. Weeks passed. Mr. Hahn sold what little he had left, his tools, his furniture, anything of value. He rented a tiny room near the bus station, barely big enough for a bed and a chair. Mrs. Lee came by one afternoon, worried. "Uncle Hahn, why live here? It's small, lonely." He smiled. "Loneliness doesn't scare me anymore. I've lived through worse." He made tea for her, hands trembling slightly as he poured. "You know," he said, "I thought retirement would mean peace, but peace doesn't come from money, it comes from love, and I guess mine ran out." She didn't know how to respond. The words hung in the air like smoke. He looked out the window, the street below buzzing faintly with life. "Maybe one day he'll realize what he's done," he murmured. "Maybe then I can forgive him." The seas, the cruel of the taked and the priest, also from the bran and bediculous sigins of the class, the dissicud vis spi. When I first heard his story, I couldn't stop thinking about it. How does a child, raised with love and sacrifice, grow into someone who forgets the meaning of gratitude? It's easy to blame money, to say success changes people, but it's deeper than that. It's about respect, values, and the quiet dignity of those who gave us everything without asking for anything in return. Mr. Hahn never wanted his money back. He never wanted luxury or comfort. All he ever wanted was acknowledgement, a simple thank you, a gesture that said his life's work had meant something. But when that's taken away, when trust is broken, what's left? Just silence. If you're listening to this, take a moment. Think about your parents. Call them, visit them, tell them they matter, because one day, when they're gone, you'll wish you had. Mr. Hahn's story isn't rare. It happens quietly in countless homes around the world. But it reminds us that love, when taken for granted, doesn't disappear with anger. It fades with sorrow. And the quiet heartbreak of a parent is the heaviest silence in the world. After that day, Mr. Hahn didn't see his son again for a long time. The silence between them grew like a wall, thick and cold. He never called, never sent a letter, not even a short text. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The pain didn't fade, it just became part of his breathing, part of the air he carried wherever he went. He lived simply in his small rented room near the bus station. The room smelled faintly of old wood and dust. A single window let in light from the street, where buses rumbled past and strangers came and went. Sometimes he would sit there all morning watching people hurry by, each with their own purpose, their own destination. He used to imagine what it felt like to still have one. Every morning he boiled water for tea, even if there was no one to share it with. The sound of the kettle was the only sound that reminded him he was still alive. He'd pour the tea carefully, set 2 cups on the table, and leave one untouched, as if his son might walk in one day and say, "Dad, I'm home." But the cup always stayed full, cold, untouched. One day, while sweeping the floor, he found an old photograph beneath the cabinet, a picture of him and David at the beach. David was maybe 8 or 9, sitting on his father's shoulders, both laughing, salt water splashing around their feet. Mr. Hahn stared at it for a long time. That photo wasn't just a memory, it was proof that love had once existed between them. He touched the edges gently, whispering, "Where did we go wrong, my son?" Even in his quiet suffering, Mr. Hahn was not bitter. He didn't curse life, didn't blame fate. He believed people lost their way sometimes. That was all. But deep down, a part of him wished just once that his son would remember the man who raised him, the man who had given him everything he had. As time went on, his body began to weaken. Age doesn't wait for anyone. His hands shook more, his legs grew stiff, and sometimes, when the wind was strong, he felt the cold deep in his bones. But every morning, he still went for a short walk. The local shop owners knew him well. He always greeted them with a smile, even if his eyes carried sadness. There was one little grocery shop run by a middle-aged woman named Mina. She often saw him buying the same few things, bread, tea, and sometimes a few apples. One day, as he struggled to count his change, she noticed how thin his hands were. "Uncle Hahn," she said softly, "don't worry about the extra coins, it's on me." He shook his head gently. "No, no, child. I always pay what I owe." She smiled. "You can owe me a story then. You always seem like someone who's lived many." He laughed softly. "Stories, yes. Too many, perhaps." Over time, Mina became a friend, or at least the closest thing he had to one. She'd often give him leftover bread at the end of the day, pretending it was unsellable just so he would accept it. Sometimes they'd sit outside the shop and talk about small things, the weather, the rising prices, the noisy kids from the neighborhood. But one evening, as the sun was setting, she noticed him looking distant. "Uncle Hahn," she said, "is something bothering you?" He took a deep breath. "I had a son," he began slowly, "a good boy once. But he changed. Life changed him. And now he's gone, though he's still alive. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. He continued, "When you're young, you think love is enough. You think raising your child with kindness guarantees they'll be kind too. But life doesn't promise that. Sometimes you give so much that there's nothing left for them to respect." The cursed one. His eyes glistened. "I thought love was like water, endless, renewing. But even the ocean runs dry when it's drained too long." Mina looked at him quietly, her heart heavy. "Maybe he'll come back one day," she said softly. "Maybe," he whispered. "But even if he does, I don't know if I'll still be here to open the door." That night, Mina couldn't sleep. The next morning, she left a small envelope on his table when he wasn't looking. Inside, there was a note. "You remind me of my father. Please don't lose hope. Some things heal slowly, but they do heal." When Mr. Hahn found it later, he smiled for the first time in weeks. He folded the note neatly and kept it inside his wallet, right next to the photo of his son at the beach. Days passed peacefully. He found small routines to fill the emptiness, feeding stray cats, watering a neighbor's plants, fixing broken stools for people nearby. He didn't ask for money. It was just something to do, something to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet. Then, one afternoon, as he sat outside his room sipping tea, a young man approached him. "Excuse me, sir, are you Mr. Hahn?" "Yes," he replied, curious. "I'm from the construction company downtown. We're doing some renovations nearby. I heard you used to work in the trade?" Mr. Hahn nodded. "A long time ago, yes. Why do you ask?" The young man smiled. "We could use someone with your experience, just small things, supervising, guiding some of the younger workers. You'd be paid fairly, of course." Mr. Hahn hesitated. His hands trembled slightly, but inside him, something stirred purpose. "I'm old," he said. "Not sure how much help I'd be." The young man chuckled. "Wisdom doesn't get old, sir. We need that more than muscle." So he agreed. For the first time in years, he felt alive again. The smell of sawdust, the sound of hammers, the sight of young men working it brought back memories of who he used to be. He didn't talk much, but when he did, they listened. They called him Grandpa Hahn. "Thank you for mine of this Rios." He became something of a mentor to them, always patient, always kind. He'd show them how to measure wood correctly, how to steady their hands when cutting, how to build not just with tools, but with care. One of the boys once said, "Grandpa Hahn, you talk like building houses is like raising kids." He smiled. "It is. You build with love, you fix the cracks, and if you don't take care of it, one day it collapses." Those words stayed with them. After a few months, the project ended. The young men pooled some money together and gave him a small envelope as a thank you. Inside was about $200 and a handwritten note that said, "You taught us more than just construction. You taught us heart." He cried quietly that night, holding the letter to his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel forgotten. But fate has a strange way of circling back. One rainy evening, he was walking home when he saw a familiar car parked by the roadside, a black sedan, shining even under the grey sky. His heart skipped. He stopped. The door opened, and out stepped David. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain fell between them, soft but endless. "Dad," David said finally, his voice unsure. "It's been a while." Mr. Hahn didn't move. "Yes, it has. I've been looking for you," David continued. "Mom's old friend said you moved here." "Why?" Mr. Hahn asked quietly. "Need more money." David shook his head, shame clouding his eyes. "No, Dad. I came to say I'm sorry." The old man looked at him for a long time. He didn't trust his own heart to speak. "Sorry," he repeated, the word tasting heavy. David nodded, drenched in rain. "I lost everything, Dad. The business failed. My wife left. The car's gone. I had no one else to turn to." There was silence. Only the rain answered. Mr. Hahn turned away, staring at the puddles forming on the ground. When you took that money, you didn't just empty my bank, David. You emptied my trust. You took away my dignity. David fell to his knees. I know, Dad. I was stupid. I thought money would make me respected. But I lost everything that mattered. For a long while, the only sound was the rain hitting the ground. Then, slowly, Mr. Hahn reached out his hand. Get up, he said. David hesitated, then stood. His father looked into his eyes and said softly, You can't undo what you've done, but you can start again with honesty this time. David nodded, tears mixing with the rain. I will, Dad. I promise. That night, they sat together in the small room, sipping hot tea. No grand gestures, no speeches, just quiet. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't come with words. It comes with shared silence, the kind that says, I still love you, despite everything. And as Mr. Hahn looked at his son, older now, broken but human again, he realized something. Maybe love doesn't run out after all. Maybe it just hides, waiting for a reason to return. He smiled faintly, whispering, Welcome home, my son. The rain outside began to fade, and for the first time in a long, long while, the house didn't feel empty anymore. The rain that night didn't stop easily. It came down softly at first, like a whisper, then grew heavier, as if the sky itself wanted to wash away years of silence and regret. Inside that tiny room near the bus station, the air smelled of wet clothes and cheap tea, but for the first time in a long time, warmth had returned. Father and son sat across from each other, not speaking much, just listening to the rain, letting time do what words couldn't. Mr. Hahn looked at David's face, the same boy he'd once carried on his shoulders, now older, weary, his eyes filled with guilt. He saw traces of the man David had become and of the child he used to be. He wanted to be angry, to ask why, to demand answers, but none of it mattered now. Sometimes love survives not because it forgets, but because it refuses to stop caring. David broke the silence first. Dad, he said softly, I don't know how to start over. Everything's gone. My wife left months ago. I don't even have a job anymore. Mr. Hahn sipped his tea slowly. You start with honesty, he said. That's the only thing you have left when everything else is gone. David nodded, eyes down. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not, his father said gently, but that doesn't mean I won't give it. They didn't hug, they didn't cry. They just sat there in silence until the rain finally stopped. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. It was fragile, uncertain, but real. The next morning, sunlight crept through the window, painting soft gold on the walls. David was already awake, sweeping the floor, trying to tidy up. Mr. Hahn watched him quietly. He hadn't seen his son move like that in years, with humility, not pride. When David noticed him, he smiled awkwardly. The place needed a bit of cleaning, he said. Mr. Hahn nodded approvingly. It's good to see you doing something useful again. David chuckled softly. Guess I had to lose everything to remember what matters. They ate breakfast together, just rice and kimchi, simple but comforting. David ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if he'd forgotten what real food tasted like when shared with someone who cared. Mr. Hahn noticed how thin he'd become, how tired his eyes were. You should eat more, he said quietly. You look like a man who hasn't rested in months. David smiled faintly. Rest feels like a luxury these days. They're either having Mars because this, and anything. For the next few days, David stayed with his father. He helped around the neighborhood, fixing fences, painting doors, carrying groceries for old women. People were surprised to see him. They'd all known what happened years ago. Rumors in small towns travel fast. But they also saw something different in him now. He wasn't the same arrogant man who had once walked around with expensive shoes and a shiny car. He was quieter, humbler, human again. Mina, the grocery shop owner, noticed him too. One afternoon, she saw David helping his father carry groceries. When they came to pay, she smiled warmly. "It's good to see you two together again." David bowed slightly. "Thank you. I've caused him enough pain already." Mr. Han looked at her and said softly, "He's learning." They walked home slowly, the sunlight soft and forgiving. Later that evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, David spoke again. "Dad, I've been thinking, maybe I can find work at one of the construction sites. I know I'm not young anymore, but I can still do something." Mr. Han nodded. "There's a site I know. I used to help there. They need people who are willing to work hard, not just those who think they're too good for it." David smiled faintly. "I think I've had enough of thinking I'm too good for anything." So the next morning, they went together to the construction site. The young workers there greeted Mr. Han warmly. "Grandpa Han!" they shouted when they saw him. David looked surprised. "They call you that?" Mr. Han smiled. "They're good kids. I taught them a few things. They remind me that even when life takes everything from you, you can still give something back." The foreman recognized him immediately. "Mr. Han, haven't seen you in weeks. Who's this?" "My son," Mr. Han said simply. "He's looking for work." The foreman looked David up and down, then nodded. "We can always use another pair of hands, but tell him we work hard here. No room for pride." Mr. Han glanced at David. "He'll manage." That day, David started from the bottom, carrying cement, moving tools, taking orders. It was tough, humiliating even, but he didn't complain. Each drop of sweat felt like repentance. Mr. Han watched him quietly, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, pride, cautious but real. At lunchtime, they sat together under a tree, eating simple sandwiches. David looked at his father and said, "You know, I used to think working like this was beneath me, but now I understand this kind of work builds more than houses. It builds people." Mr. Han nodded slowly. "That's what I've been trying to tell you your whole life." As the days passed, their relationship began to heal. Not with grand apologies or emotional speeches, but with small gestures, shared meals, long walks, quiet laughter. One night, after a long day of work, David cooked dinner for the first time in years. The food wasn't perfect, too salty, a bit burnt, but Mr. Han ate every bite. "You're getting better," he said with a teasing grin. David laughed. "You're just saying that because I cooked." "Maybe," Mr. Han said, "but effort counts more than taste." Sometimes, late at night, Mr. Han would wake up and see his son asleep on the floor, using a folded jacket as a pillow. He'd quietly place a blanket over him and stand there for a while, just watching. A small smile would appear on his face. "Maybe this is what peace looks like," he'd whisper to himself. But peace is fragile, and life, as always, had one more test in store. One afternoon, while working on site, Mr. Han suddenly felt dizzy. The heat was unbearable that day, and his body simply couldn't keep up. He collapsed, his hammer falling from his hand, the sound echoing through the construction yard. "Grandpa Han!" the workers shouted, rushing to him. David dropped everything and ran to his father's side. "Dad! Dad, can you hear me?" Mr. Han's breathing was shallow, his skin pale. "I'm fine," he whispered, trying to sit up, but David held him still. "No, you're not. Don't move. I'm calling an ambulance. His live to be closed to the Brodden Mintings." At the hospital, the doctor's words hit David like a storm. "Your father's heart is weak. He's been overexerting himself. He needs rest, proper rest." David sat beside his father's bed, guilt washing over him again. "You shouldn't have been working," he said softly. Mr. Han smiled faintly. "Work kept me alive, son. But now, maybe it's your turn to build something not with your hands, but with your choices." David took his father's hand gently. "I promise, Dad. I'll take care of you this time. No more mistakes." In the weeks that followed, he did just that. He found small repair jobs, saved every penny, and made sure his father ate well and took his medicine. Slowly, Mr. Han regained his strength, though he moved slower now, more carefully, Every morning, they'd walk to the park nearby. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. The silence between them was no longer painful. It was peaceful. One morning, David said, "Dad, I want to build a small shop, nothing big, just a place to fix furniture or tools. I know it's not much, but maybe it's a start." Mr. Hahn smiled. "Every great thing starts small. Just don't forget what you learned: humility, gratitude, and love." David nodded. "I won't, Dad." Months later, with help from the workers they once labored beside, David opened a small workshop. The sign outside read, "Hahn and Son Repairs." It wasn't fancy, but it was honest work. People came for small things: a broken chair, a wobbly table, a door that wouldn't close right, and they left with more than fixed wood. They left with warmth, kindness, and the story of a father and son rebuilding not just furniture, but their bond. One evening after closing the shop, David turned to his father and said, "I think Mom would have liked this." Mr. Hahn looked up at the fading sky. "She would have been proud of you," he said softly. David smiled, his eyes shining. "I hope so." As they walked home together, their shadows stretched long across the road. There was no more anger, no more regret, just quiet understanding. They had both been broken once, but somehow, through pain and forgiveness, they had found their way back to each other. And as they reached their small home, Mr. Hahn looked at his son, the same boy who had once lost his way, and whispered, "You see, David, even when the house falls apart, if the foundation is love, you can always rebuild." The wind blew softly, carrying away the dust of the past, and for the first time in years, the stars above them didn't feel distant anymore. They felt like home. For a long while, peace finally settled in their lives. The little workshop that bore their names, Hahn and Son Repairs, became more than just a business. It became a quiet symbol of redemption. People in the neighborhood began to talk about the father and son who fixed things with care, things that others would have thrown away. A cracked chair, a broken frame, a clock that hadn't ticked in years, they all found life again in that small shop. And somehow, in repairing those broken things, the two men were mending themselves. Every morning, David would unlock the door and sweep the front step while Mr. Hahn brewed tea inside. He liked to sit by the window, watching his son work. It reminded him of the days when he was young and strong, when his hands built homes instead of repairing memories. Sometimes he would smile quietly and think, maybe this is how forgiveness works, not in words, but in time. Business was modest but steady. Locals trusted them. People said, "They don't just fix furniture, they fix it like it matters." David always smiled when he heard that. He had stopped chasing prestige. His hands, once soft and ambitious, were now calloused again, but they carried purpose. He no longer lived for others' approval, only for the quiet satisfaction of doing something right. Still, even in this small piece, life has its way of testing what we've built. It came unexpectedly, as it always does, a slow creeping of something that no one saw coming. It started with Mr. Hahn coughing. At first, it was light, something they both ignored. "Just a little cold," he'd say, waving it off. But the cough lingered, deepened, grew heavy. Some nights, David would hear him coughing in his sleep, and he'd quietly bring water to his bedside. "Dad, we should see a doctor," he said one morning. "I'm fine," the old man replied, though his face said otherwise. But as the weeks went by, his strength began to fade. He started forgetting small things: where he left his glasses, the name of a customer who had just left. One day, he dropped a cup, and it shattered on the floor. He just stared at it, lost. David rushed over. "Dad, are you okay? The sea, the Telejan was the clan, in my the clan and Bettig. I don't know why I dropped it," he said softly, almost embarrassed. That was when David knew this wasn't just age. Something was wrong. He took him to the hospital, the same one where they had gone months ago. The smell of disinfectant and quiet footsteps filled the halls. The doctor, kind but serious, looked at the test results and sighed. Your father's heart is weakening again, and his lungs are showing early signs of disease. He'll need rest, real rest this time. No work, no stress. David nodded slowly, holding the papers in trembling hands. Can he recover? The doctor's voice was calm but firm. We can manage it, but he's old. What he needs most is peace and support. 7-2 must seen his will for. David thanked him, but inside he felt something break. He had just gotten his father back after years of distance, regret, and silence, and now fate was threatening to take him away again. That evening, when they came home, Mr. Hahn tried to act as if nothing had happened. Doctors always worry too much, he said, forcing a smile. I'm fine. But David saw through it. He could see the tiredness in his father's eyes, the effort it took just to breathe normally. He made a quiet decision, then he would take care of the workshop alone and let his father rest. Dad, he said, I'll handle the shop for a while. You just stay home, okay? Mr. Hahn frowned. I can still help. The dime repressors the Tadoons by heard not one say. You've done enough. It's my turn. The old man looked at him for a long time. There was something proud, almost peaceful, in his expression. I suppose it is. So the next morning, for the first time, David went to open the shop alone. The sound of the key turning in the lock felt heavier somehow. The small bell above the door jingled, and the quiet smell of wood and varnish filled the air. He looked around at the worn tools, the old workbench, the half-fixed chair his father had been working on, and whispered to himself, I'll keep it running for both of us. Customers noticed the change. Where's your father today? They'd ask. Resting, David would say with a smile. But he's still the boss. They'd laugh softly, some nodding knowingly. Word spread quickly the old man wasn't well. People began dropping by the house, bringing fruit, flowers, and warm soup. They'd sit with Mr. Hahn for a few minutes, share stories, and leave quietly. It touched him deeply. I didn't know people cared this much, he said one afternoon. They do, David replied. You gave them kindness. They're giving it back. The days grew slower after that. Mr. Hahn spent most of his time sitting by the window, reading, or just watching the street outside. Sometimes, David would come home from the shop and find him asleep in his chair, sunlight resting gently on his face. He looked peaceful, almost like he was finally getting the rest he'd earned all his life. One evening, as David was closing the shop, he found something in the drawer, an old envelope, yellowed with time. Inside was a letter in his father's handwriting. It wasn't long, but every word carried weight. Son, if you ever read this, it means I'm no longer beside you. Don't mourn for me. I lived a full life, one filled with love, even in pain. What hurt me once has long been forgiven. The only thing I ever wanted was to see you find your peace not through success, but through kindness. If you can give the world even half the love you once took from it, then you've done more than enough. And remember, no one is too broken to be fixed. David read it twice, then a third time. The ink had faded in places, but the words burned clear in his heart. Tears came quietly, not from regret this time, but from understanding. That night, he sat by his father's bedside and held his hand. You don't need to write letters anymore, Dad, he whispered. I hear you. Mr. Hahn stirred slightly, opening his eyes. Letters, he said weakly. David smiled. I found one you wrote. You always knew I'd need your words more than your money. The old man chuckled softly, his voice thin but warm. Money disappears, son. But words, they stay. Yeah, David said, squeezing his hand gently. They stay. The dues so many medvir on the benedictions can feeling go to beer. Not his sementarier. From that day on, David made sure every repaired chair, every fixed table, every small act of care in their workshop carried a story. He told customers about his father, about the lessons he'd learned, about the meaning of rebuilding what's broken. And slowly, the little shop became more than a place of work. It became a place of healing for others too. People would come not just to fix things, but to talk, to share, to remember someone they loved. Some even said, "It's strange walking into your shop feels like walking into forgiveness." David would smile, always glancing at the small framed photo of his father that now hung on the wall. "That's exactly what it's meant to be," he'd say. One spring morning, when the cherry blossoms began to bloom, he closed the shop early. He walked to the hill just beyond town, where the trees were in full bloom, the same place his father used to take him fishing when he was a child. He sat under the pink petals falling softly around him and whispered to the wind, "You were right, Dad. Nothing's too broken to be fixed, not even me." The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of blossoms and sawdust, the smell of work, of life, of love that had endured all things. And somewhere, deep in his heart, David knew his father could hear him. He smiled, stood up, and walked back toward town. The evening light fell softly on the sign above the shop, "Han and Son Repairs." The letters were a little faded now, but still strong like the bond they represented. And as the first stars began to appear in the sky, David looked up and whispered, "That one's still ours, Dad, always will be." Time has a strange way of softening pain. Seasons changed, but the memory of Mr. Han lingered like the scent of old wood and morning tea. The small workshop carried on quietly, and though one pair of hands was gone, the spirit that built the place remained. David still opened the shop at dawn and closed it when the sky turned orange. Every sound, the squeak of hinges, the scrape of sandpaper, the gentle hammering of nails, felt like a conversation between him and his father. The photo of Mr. Han still hung near the counter, framed simply, dusted every morning. Customers would often glance at it and ask, "Was that your father?" David would smile softly and nod. "Yes, he taught me everything I know." Life began to find rhythm again. The workshop grew slowly, attracting new faces. Word spread that David was the kind of man who didn't just fix things, he cared for them. Some said he had a gift, the way he could bring broken things back to life, like he was mending souls, not wood. And maybe he was, because every time he smoothed a piece of rough timber or repaired a crack, he thought of the life he'd cracked once and how love had patiently mended it. One cold morning, a woman came into the shop. She looked to be in her late 30s, well-dressed but tired. Her eyes carried a heaviness that only heartbreak can give. She placed a small wooden box on the counter, cracked along the edges, one hinge missing. "Can you fix this?" she asked quietly. David picked it up gently, turning it over in his hands. It was old, hand-carved, the kind of box that held something precious. "Of course," he said. "But this isn't just a box, is it?" She hesitated. "It belonged to my father," she said softly. "He passed away last year. I dropped it during the move, and I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." David nodded. "We never should throw away what carries love." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "You sound like him." "I sound like my father too sometimes," he said with a chuckle. "It sneaks up on you, doesn't it?" She nodded, and for a moment they shared that quiet understanding, two people bound by the invisible thread of loss and love. When she left, David placed the box on his workbench and began carefully removing the broken hinge. As he worked, his mind wandered. He thought about how much his life had changed, how far he'd come from the man who once valued money over love. The wood beneath his hands felt alive, warm, like it carried whispers of every story it had held. By evening, the box looked whole again. He polished it until the grain glowed softly in the lamplight, then lined the inside with new velvet, deep blue, the same color as the sea where his father had once taken him fishing. He smiled, remembering. The woman returned the next day. When David handed her the box, her eyes widened. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It looks just like before." He shook his head. "Not just like before, Stronger now. The cracks are part of its story. This is no to have no to you two. She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You really do fix more than furniture, don't you?" David smiled. "Maybe, but it's what my father taught me. Nothing is ever too broken to be made new." When she left, David stood there for a while, looking at the door she had just walked through. Something about her had stirred something deeper in him, a reminder of all the people walking around carrying invisible brokenness. He decided that day to start something new. He put a small sign by the window. It read, "Free repairs for the elderly and single parents." At first, only a few people came. An old woman with a broken chair, a young mother with a stroller missing a wheel, a quiet man with a clock that hadn't ticked since his wife died. Each one brought something small, but every object came with a story. David listened to them all. One woman said, "My husband used to fix everything. Now that he's gone, I can't even open a jar without thinking of him." David repaired her cabinet door and said gently, "Then let this door remind you he's still with you, still fixing things in his own way." She smiled through tears. Day by day, the workshop became more than a business. It became a refuge, a place where people came not only to mend their things, but to be seen, to be heard, to remember. One afternoon, David received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a short note, "You don't know me, but I heard what you do for people. My son left home after we argued. I haven't heard from him in 2 years. I don't know if fixing something broken will bring him back, but maybe it will help me wait." The letter was signed, Mrs. Lee. David's hands trembled slightly as he read it. The name felt like fate. Mrs. Lee, the same neighbor who had once brought apples to his father years ago. He folded the letter gently and placed it on his desk. The next day, an older woman walked into the shop, holding a photo frame with a cracked glass. "You must be David," she said softly. "I'm Mrs. Lee." "Majadu's fall." He bowed respectfully. "I remember you," he said. "You helped my father once." She smiled. "And now it's your turn to help me, I suppose." She handed him the frame. It held a picture of a young man smiling, standing near a river. The glass was broken right across his face. David swallowed hard. "Your son?" She nodded. "He left after we fought, said he needed space. I keep this photo on my table, but every time I see the crack, I feel like I failed him." David placed the frame carefully on the counter. "Then let's fix it together," he said quietly. As he worked, Mrs. Lee sat nearby, watching him. "Your father would be proud of you," she said suddenly. "He was a good man." "There's Self." David paused for a moment, the memory of Mr. Han's voice echoing in his mind. "He taught me everything that matters," he said. When the frame was finally fixed, he replaced the photo and handed it to her. "There," he said. "Whole again." She looked at it and smiled, tears welling up. "You know," she whispered, "sometimes I think God sends people back to us in different ways." David didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. After she left, he closed the shop early and walked home under the setting Sunday. The streets glowed orange, the same warm hue that had painted his father's small room years ago. He stopped at a small stall by the corner and bought 2 cups of tea. He placed one on the bench beside him, an old habit he couldn't let go of. He whispered softly, "We're still fixing things, Dad. You'd be proud." The wind stirred, gentle, carrying the faint scent of sawdust and tea leaves, and for a brief moment David could almost hear his father's laugh again, low, warm, and full of life. That night, before closing the shop, David lit a small candle by his father's photo. The flame flickered softly, dancing with the shadows. He looked at it and said quietly, "You once told me love doesn't end, it changes shape. I think I finally understand what you meant. Rilius, the end myself. Rilius C. in good 9. He turned off the lights, leaving only the candle burning in the darkness, a small, steady glow, like the memory of a love that refuses to die. The candlelight that night flickered softly against the walls of the workshop. Its small, warm glow painted the space in gold, reflecting off the tools, the wooden benches, and the tiny dust motes floating in the air. It was quiet, but it wasn't the empty kind of quiet anymore. It was the peace that comes after pain, the kind that hums gently in the background of a life slowly mended. David woke early the next morning. As always, he swept the shop floor, brewed tea, and unlocked the front door just as the sky began to lighten. It was routine now, but to him, it wasn't routine, it was ritual. Each movement felt sacred, a way to honor the memory of his father and the lessons that still whispered through the walls of that little place. The sign by the window, "Free repairs for the elderly and single parents," had faded a little over time, but people noticed it every day. Sometimes they would just stand outside, staring at it, as if those words spoke directly to something inside them. One morning, a teenage boy stopped by the door. He couldn't have been more than 16, wearing a torn jacket, holding something wrapped in cloth. His shoes were worn down to the soles, and his eyes had that mix of fear and stubbornness that only youth carries. David looked up from his bench and said, "Come in, son. What do you have there?" The boy hesitated for a moment, then stepped in slowly. "My name's Leo," he said softly. "I heard you fix things for free." David smiled. "Sometimes. Depends on what's broken." The boy unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was an old guitar, strings missing, body cracked along the edge. It looked like it had been through years of neglect. "It was my dad's," the boy said. "He used to play it for me when I was little, but he left when I was 9. Mom works all the time, so I found this in the attic. I thought maybe if I could fix it, she might smile again." David's throat tightened. He recognized the look in the boy's eyes, the quiet ache of someone trying to fix more than just an object. He nodded. "You came to the right place." For the next few hours, they worked together in silence. David showed him how to sand the wood gently, how to replace the tuning pegs, how to line the body where it had split. The boy watched closely, hands trembling at first but growing steadier with every movement. "Did your dad teach you how to fix things?" Leo asked quietly. David smiled faintly. "No. He taught me something better, how to fix myself." Leo frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "How was set? It had with the do and dones the tool ready day." David leaned over the bench, tightening a screw. "Sometimes the things we love break people, trust, family. You can't glue them back the same way, but if you're patient, if you work gently, they become stronger at the broken places." The boy nodded slowly, the idea sinking into him. When the guitar was finally done, it looked almost new. David strummed a chord, and the sound filled the workshop, warm, imperfect, but alive. Leo's eyes widened. "It sounds like him," he whispered. David handed it to him. "Then play it for your mother. Let her remember that not everything that's gone has to stay gone." Leo smiled, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, sir. Have not slaven purse to never tension duun ratis. To the door the distonidis." After the boy left, David sat alone for a long while. The echo of the guitar's last note still lingered in the air. He looked at his father's picture and said quietly, "You see, Dad, we keep passing it on. The fixing, the love, it keeps going." Days turned into weeks, and word about the workshop spread even further. Local newspapers wrote small features about the man who repairs for love. People came from nearby towns, bringing broken heirlooms, worn toys, and old memories wrapped in boxes. But they didn't come just for the repairs. They came for the feeling that this place gave them. One afternoon, as David was closing up, he noticed a man standing outside, watching quietly. He looked rough, unshaven, his clothes faded and dusty from travel. There was something weary about him, something that reminded David of himself years ago. He opened the door and said, "You can come in. We're still open for a bit." The man nodded slowly and stepped inside. "I'm sorry. I just didn't know if I should." "What brings you here?" David asked. The man took a deep breath and placed something small on the counter, a silver pocket watch, its face cracked, the second hand frozen in place. "It was my son's," he said, voice trembling. "He passed away last year. He used to wear this every day. I kept it in my pocket, but last week I dropped it. I thought maybe if it works again, I could hear time move for him." David picked up the watch gently, turning it in his hands. He could feel the man's grief in the metal, in the way his fingers lingered on the edge. "I'll do my best," he said softly. The man nodded, his eyes filling. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "You fix things, like you understand what it means to lose them." David smiled faintly. "I do." He spent hours that night working on the watch. The gears were delicate, old, rusted in places. It took patience, steady hands, and quiet breath. Every tick he restored felt like reviving a heartbeat. When he finally placed the back cover on, he listened. Tick, 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 soft, steady, alive again. When the man came the next morning, David handed it to him carefully. The man held it up to his ear and closed his eyes. Tears rolled down his cheeks. "It's like he's still here," he whispered. David smiled gently. "Maybe he never really left. Maybe we just needed to listen closely enough." The man looked at him, unable to speak. He put the watch in his pocket and simply said, "Thank you." Then he turned and walked out into the sunlight, shoulders straighter than when he'd come in. That night, as David closed the shop, he stood by the window for a long time, watching the world outside, the soft glow of streetlights, people passing by, the sound of laughter somewhere distant. Life went on, as it always does, but he felt his father's presence stronger than ever. He whispered into the quiet, "You were right, Dad. Love doesn't disappear. It finds new hands to live in." He looked around the shop at the shelves of repaired items, at the small photo on the wall, at the tools worn smooth by time, and realized that everything here, every scar, every story, every smile that walked through the door, was part of something much bigger than himself. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. It was about connection, about giving people a reason to believe again in care, in forgiveness, in second chances. The next morning, David opened early. The air outside was crisp, the sky pale blue. As he hung the open sign on the door, he noticed a young couple walking by, hand in hand, laughing softly. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel that familiar pang of loneliness. He just smiled, happy that the world still had love in it. He turned back toward his workbench, poured himself a cup of tea, and said quietly, "Another day, Dad. Let's keep fixing. There's this not hand." The days drifted by quietly, one blending softly into the next, like brushstrokes of a familiar painting. The little workshop continued to hum with life, the smell of varnish and sawdust, the gentle tapping of tools, the murmur of grateful customers. It had become a kind of sanctuary for the town, a place where broken things and broken hearts found new purpose. And at the center of it all was David, calm and steady, the man who had learned how to build love from splinters. It had been almost a year since his father passed, and though the ache still lived quietly in him, it no longer hurt the way it once did. It was no longer a wound, it was a presence, gentle and constant, like the sound of wind through the trees. Sometimes, while sanding a chair or fixing an old drawer, he would catch himself humming one of his father's favorite songs, and he'd smile without realizing it. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected arrived, a letter, neatly folded, bearing the seal of the local community center. He opened it carefully. Inside, it read, "Dear Mr. Han, we've heard about your work at Han & Son Repairs. The kindness you've shown to others has inspired many. We'd like to invite you to speak at our community event to share your story of rebuilding, love, and forgiveness. It would mean a lot to everyone here." David read it twice. He set it down, then picked it up again, unsure of what to feel. He wasn't a man who liked attention. His life had always been quiet, private, yet part of him knew this invitation wasn't about pride, it was about honoring what his father had started. That evening, he went for a walk through the town. The streets were lined with golden light from shop windows, and the scent of roasted chestnuts drifted through the air. Children were playing, laughter echoing off the walls. He walked past the park where he and his father used to sit, where the wind carried the same softness it always had. He stopped by their bench and sat down. "They want me to tell our story, Dad," he whispered. "But it's not mine alone, is it? It's ours." He closed his eyes, listening to the rustling leaves, almost hearing his father's steady voice again. "When the time comes, son, don't hide from your story. Someone out there needs to hear it." So he said yes. The following week, the community hall was full, rows of chairs, familiar faces from the town people who had come to him for repairs, for kindness, for quiet comfort. He stood on the small stage, a microphone in front of him, palms slightly trembling. For a moment, he just looked at them. All old faces, young ones, people smiling softly, waiting. And then he began. "I'm not a man used to talking much," he said. "Most of my life, I've listened to people, to silence, to wood creaking under my hands. I run a small repair shop. Nothing special, just a place where things and sometimes people get put back together." A few quiet laughs rippled through the room. He smiled. "I learned everything I know from my father," he continued. "He wasn't a rich man. He built houses, raised me alone after my mother passed. He used to say, 'Love is what you build when no one's watching.' I didn't understand that back then. I thought love was just words, big gestures, the kind you see in movies. But I learned the truth the hard way." He paused for a moment, his eyes finding the floor. "There was a time I hurt the person who loved me most. I betrayed him, took from him, broke his trust, all because I thought I needed to prove something to others. And when I lost everything, he was still there, not to punish me, but to forgive me." The room was silent now, completely still. "My father taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about remembering without hate. It's about saying, 'You hurt me, but I still choose love.' That's why I built my shop. Every broken chair, every cracked box, it reminds me of what he did for me. That nothing is ever too broken to be fixed, if you care enough." He looked out at the crowd, some nodding, some wiping their eyes. "People come to my shop thinking they're bringing broken things, but most of the time it's themselves they want to repair. I don't always have the right words, but I have my hands, and I have what my father taught me. That's enough." There was a long, heavy silence, the kind that carries warmth instead of discomfort. Then a gentle wave of applause began, soft at first, then louder, echoing through the hall. David lowered his head slightly, humbled. After the event, people lined up to speak with him. Some just shook his hand. Others shared small stories of their own losses and forgiveness. One man said, "You reminded me to call my father again." A woman said, "I forgave my daughter last week. Maybe your story helped." Each word filled David's heart like sunlight through clouds. It wasn't pride, he felt it was peace. The kind of peace his father must have felt when he'd watched his son as a boy, unaware of the storms to come, still hopeful, still whole. When the hall finally emptied, the organizer approached him. "Thank you, Mr. Han," she said. "That was beautiful. Would you consider teaching a small workshop here once a week? Maybe show young people the skills you know, both with wood and with heart." David smiled. "I think my father would have liked that idea." And so, a new chapter began. Every Saturday morning, the community center filled with the sound of laughter, sawdust, and hammers. Children and teenagers learned how to use tools safely, how to repair simple things, but more importantly, they learned patience, attention, and care. David didn't lecture much. He let them discover meaning through doing. One boy asked him once, "Why do you fix old stuff when you could just buy new things?" David smiled. "Because some things are worth saving. You don't throw away what still has life in it. You just give it a little time." As weeks turned into months, his classes grew. Parents came to watch, grandparents came to help, and the workshop slowly turned into a gathering place, not just for repairs, but for stories. People brought food, music, laughter. For the first time in years, David felt what his father must have felt long ago, the quiet joy of building something that mattered. One day, after class ended, a little girl approached him with something wrapped in cloth. "Mr. Han," she said shyly, "can you fix this for me?" He unwrapped it gently. Inside was a small wooden bird with a broken wing. "It was my dad's," she said. "He made it before he went away." David smiled softly. "Of course I can, but do you want to help me fix it?" Her eyes brightened. "Can I?" Together they worked, her tiny hands steady, his patient and guiding. When they finished, he handed it back to her. "There," he said. "Now it can fly again." She looked at him with wide eyes. "You're really good at fixing things." He smiled. "Only because someone once fixed me." That night, when he closed the shop, he stood outside for a long while. The stars above shimmered faintly, scattered like dust on velvet. He looked up at one in particular, bright, steady, the same one his father used to point out when they went fishing all those years ago. He whispered, "You see, Dad, we're still building, still fixing, just like you said." And in the silence that followed, the world felt full again, full of echoes, of memory, of love that had never truly left. The seasons turned again, slow and gentle, as they always do. The air grew cooler, the trees reddened, and mornings came wrapped in mist. The little workshop, now almost an emblem of hope in town, stood quietly at the corner of Maple Street, its windows fogged with warmth, the smell of tea and sawdust always drifting out through the open door. David had found a rhythm in his life. The community center classes had grown. Kids would wait outside early on Saturdays, laughing, eager to learn. Parents would stop by the workshop just to talk, to thank him, to bring small gifts, homemade bread, jam, a simple handshake. It wasn't wealth that filled his life. It was something deeper, steadier. He didn't live for applause or recognition anymore. He lived for moments, for the smile of a child holding a toy he'd just fixed, for the quiet satisfaction of turning broken wood into something whole again. But as peace returned to his days, life, as it often does, prepared one last lesson for him. It began on an ordinary afternoon. The bell above the shop door rang, and when David looked up, his breath caught for a moment. Standing there was a woman he hadn't seen in over a decade. Her face had changed, softened by time, but her eyes, those same sharp, intelligent eyes, still held the familiarity of a life once shared. "Hello, David," she said softly. He froze. Anna. It was his ex-wife. The one who had stood beside him in the early days of their marriage, before pride and greed had torn their lives apart. The woman he had betrayed not just with mistakes, but with his distance, his stubbornness, his obsession with appearances. She stepped closer, looking around the workshop. "You kept busy," she said, her voice carrying both curiosity and something like sorrow. David nodded slowly. "This place, it saved me," he said quietly. She smiled faintly, running her hand along one of the finished tables. "It smells the same," she murmured. "Wood and peace." He didn't know what to say. So much time had passed, but the air between them was thick with the weight of what they hadn't said back then, all the apologies, all the things they had both done wrong. Finally, she broke the silence. "I heard about your shop through the papers," she said. "People talk about you, you know, about how you help everyone." "I just fix things," he said humbly. "No," she replied softly. "You heal them." He looked at her carefully, wondering why she was really there. "Why did you come, Anna?" "The gles the människor to see tus in the Westen, the gles the kos the klas." She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden jewelry box, its lid cracked, hinges rusted. "This," she said, "it was my mother's. You made it for me when we first got married. Remember?" He took it in his hands, and for a moment his throat closed. He did remember the carving on the lid, the initials, the tiny heart he'd added secretly beneath it. "I'd forgotten how it looked," he whispered. She smiled sadly. "I dropped it last month. It felt symbolic, somehow, like a reminder." David traced the cracks with his fingers. "You want me to fix it?" "I don't know," she said softly. "Maybe I just wanted to see if it could be fixed." He did not start. He nodded, understanding that she wasn't just talking about the box. They stood there in silence for a moment, two people shaped by time, regret, and memory. Then David said quietly, "Leave it with me. I'll see what I can do." She nodded. "Thank you." When she left, the bell chimed again, and the workshop felt different, heavier, quieter. David sat down at his bench and stared at the box for a long time. The cracks weren't deep, the damage could be repaired. But it was the weight of the past that made his hands shake. He remembered the nights they'd fought his pride, her frustration, the way he'd refused to listen. He remembered how she had looked at him the day she left, her eyes full of love and exhaustion at the same time. "You care more about what people think of you than who you really are," she'd said. She hadn't been wrong. Now, years later, he was no longer that man. But facing this old piece of wood, he felt like he was sanding away at his own history. He worked on the box carefully. Each motion was deliberate, reverent. He cleaned the hinges, glued the cracks, sanded the surface, and restained the wood until it gleamed softly under the lamp. He even found a small brass key to replace the one it had lost. When it was done, he sat there staring at it for a long while. It looked whole again, not new, but strong. The cracks were still visible, faint but real, like veins of gold running through the wood, imperfect, yet beautiful. A week later, Anna returned. She stepped into the shop quietly, her eyes scanning the familiar space once more. David handed her the box gently. "It's done." She opened it slowly. Inside, the velvet lining had been replaced, smooth and new. Her eyes softened as she ran her fingers over it. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "It's not the same as before, but maybe that's better." She looked up at him, then really looked at him, and for a moment, they weren't strangers anymore. They were two people who had loved, failed, and survived. "You've changed, David," she said quietly. "I had to," he replied. "Losing everything was the only way to see what I'd done." She nodded slowly. "I'm glad you found peace." He hesitated, then said softly, "And you? Did you find yours?" She smiled, small and tired but real. "I think I'm still learning how." They stood there for a moment longer, the kind of silence that doesn't ache but comforts. Then she picked up the box and said, "Thank you for fixing it, and for everything else." When she left, David didn't stop her. He didn't need to. Some things aren't meant to be reclaimed, they're meant to be released. That evening, as he locked up, he looked around the workshop. The light was dim, the tools resting quietly on their shelves, the faint smell of sawdust lingering like memory. He thought about how much his life had changed, how much he'd broken and rebuilt, and how every piece, every person, had been part of the same lesson. He whispered softly into the still air, "It's all right, Dad. I understand now. You can't keep what isn't meant to stay, but you can love it enough to let it go whole." Outside, the night settled gently over the town. The stars began to appear, faint and familiar. David looked up at one shining bright above the rooftops, their star, and smiled. "Still ours," he said quietly. "Always." Months passed after Anna's visit, and though her presence had stirred old memories, what lingered afterward was not pain, it was peace, the kind that comes when something long unresolved finally finds a quiet ending. David's days went on with their soft rhythm, the opening of the shop at dawn, the hum of gentle work, the laughter of children drifting from the community center nearby. But something had begun to shift around him. The small stories of the people he'd helped, the repaired boxes, the mended chairs, the watches that ticked again after years of silence, had started to travel beyond his little town. At first, it was just a few mentions in local newspapers. Then, one morning, a letter arrived with a logo from a larger publication. Inside was a note written in neat professional handwriting. "Mr. Hahn, we've heard remarkable stories about your workshop, how you fix broken things for those who cannot afford it, and how your kindness has changed lives. We'd like to interview you for an article about community heroes." David sat for a long time with the letter in his hands. He wasn't sure what to feel. Pride didn't come easily to him anymore. Attention made him uneasy. But he thought of his father the way he used to tell him, "If your story can light someone else's path, don't hide it under the table. Let it shine, son." So, he agreed. The journalist came the next week, a young woman named Claire, bright-eyed, curious, full of questions. She was polite, careful with her words, sensing the quiet gravity in the space. She looked around the workshop, at the photo of Mr. Hahn, at the faded sign by the window, and said softly, "It feels peaceful here." David smiled. "It's full of ghosts," he said gently, "but the kind that keep you company." They talked for hours, about his father, about forgiveness, about what it meant to rebuild. He told her the truth, not the polished, heroic version, but the messy, human one. He told her about the betrayal, the loss, the years of guilt, and the slow, patient work of redemption. At one point she asked, "Do you ever regret what happened?" He paused, sanding a piece of wood slowly. "Every day," he said. "But regret isn't punishment. It's memory trying to teach you something. If you listen, it becomes wisdom. If you ignore it, it becomes poison." When the article was published a few weeks later, it spread far beyond what he imagined. People from other towns began to write letters, handwritten notes, emails, postcards. Some thanked him for his story, others shared their own. One letter said, "I haven't spoken to my father in 10 years. After reading about you, I called him. Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late." Another read, "I lost my husband last year. Your words about fixing things helped me start fixing myself." David kept every letter. He stacked them neatly in a small wooden box, the kind his father would have made. Sometimes, after closing the shop, he'd read a few by candlelight, and each one felt like a conversation, proof that his father's lessons were still echoing out into the world. One evening, Claire returned. She stood at the door, holding a new camera, smiling warmly. "You've become a bit of a celebrity, Mr. Hahn," she teased. He laughed quietly. "I never wanted that." "I know," she said, "but people need stories like yours. Would you ever consider doing a small video, something where you talk about your father, your shop, your philosophy? It might help more people." David hesitated. The idea of speaking to a camera made him uncomfortable, but then he thought of all the times his father had told him to keep giving, to keep building. Maybe this was just another kind of building. "All right," he said finally, "but it's not going to be fancy, just honest." They filmed it in the shop, simple and unadorned. No lights, no script, just David sitting by his bench, speaking as he worked. He said, "My father used to tell me, you build a life the same way you build a chair, one nail, one joint, one mistake at a time." I didn't understand back then. I thought love was easy. I thought forgiveness was just a word. But love is work. It's what you choose to keep doing, even when it hurts. He paused, turning the piece of wood in his hands. "Sometimes people bring me things that look too broken to fix, and I tell them, it'll take time, but we'll get there. I think that's what life is, getting there, slowly, together." When the video was released online, it went far beyond their little town. It reached cities, countries. People across the world watched this quiet man talk about love, loss, and repair. The comment sections filled with messages from strangers. "This made me call my mum. I cried watching this. He reminds me of my grandfather. Please never stop doing what you do." David didn't know how to process it all. He wasn't chasing fame, he was just sharing what he'd learned. But now, it seemed, the ripples had become waves. A few months later, he received another letter, this one from a non-profit organization that worked with troubled youth. They wanted him to visit their center, to talk to the kids, maybe show them his craft. "They've been through a lot," the letter read. "They could use someone who understands rebuilding." He thought about it for days. He'd always been better with wood than with words. But something in him said yes. When he arrived at the center, the director introduced him to a group of teenagers, tough, quiet, suspicious of everyone. He recognized their eyes. They were the same eyes he'd seen in his reflection years ago, full of anger, guilt, and confusion. He began simply, "You know," he said, holding up a cracked piece of wood. "Most people would throw this away. It's ugly, broken, not worth the effort. But look closely, the grain is still strong. You just have to know where to start fixing." They watched him work, silent at first, but as the minutes passed, they began to ask questions. One boy, maybe 15, said, "What if you don't know how to fix it? What if it's too messed up?" David looked at him gently. "Then you start with what you have, one piece at a time, and if you can't do it alone, you let someone help." By the end of the session, the room was full of quiet energy, kids sanding, gluing, focusing. For the first time, many of them looked calm. The director thanked him afterward, tears in her eyes. "You did more for them in one afternoon than we've managed in weeks." David smiled softly. "I didn't fix them," he said. "They fixed themselves. I just gave them something to hold while they did it." That night, on his way home, he stopped by the same park where he used to walk with his father. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. He sat on their old bench and looked up at the sky, cloudless, clear, endless. He thought about how far things had come from the boy who had taken to the man who now gave, from a life of shame to one of quiet grace. And in that still moment he whispered, "You see, Dad, you taught me how to build. I just didn't know you were building me." The wind stirred, soft as a sigh, and the leaves above shimmered in the fading light. Somewhere, far off, a child laughed, and the sound carried on the wind, bright, pure, alive. David smiled. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was trying to make up for something. He just felt home. Years rolled forward, as gently as the tide. The seasons that once changed too fast for David to notice now seemed to move with him, not past him. His hair had gone almost white. His hands bore the marks of time and work, but they still moved with the same patience, deliberate, careful, full of quiet respect for everything they touched. The workshop stood just as it always had, small, wooden, full of sunlight that streamed through the window in the mornings and turned golden by afternoon. The air still carried the scent of sawdust, oil, and tea. The same bell above the door still chimed softly whenever someone entered, and every sound, every echo, felt alive with memory. David was older now, but not lonely. The town around him had changed, new shops, new faces, a few old ones gone, but his place remained, like a heart still beating at the same rhythm. People no longer just came to get things fixed. They came to talk, to listen, to find calm. Sometimes they'd sit quietly while David worked, as if the sound of him sanding wood was enough to settle their souls. The children who once learned from him at the community center were adults now. Some had gone to other towns, started families, opened their own workshops or businesses. But every few months, one or two would return. They'd walk into the little shop with wide smiles and say, "Mr. Hahn, do you remember me?" And David would laugh softly, because he always did. They'd bring gifts, little things they'd made with their own hands, a carved box, a chair, a small toy, each one a piece of his father's teachings carried forward through their lives. The legacy had spread far beyond what either Hahn could have imagined. One late afternoon, as the sun sank low and the shadows stretched long across the floor, a young woman stepped into the shop. She looked about 20, her hair tied back, a sketchbook tucked under her arm. She hesitated at the door before speaking. "Are you Mr. Hahn?" David looked up from his workbench and smiled. "I am. Come in." She approached slowly, glancing around the shop with quiet awe. "My mother used to come here," she said. "Her name was Mina." David's smile softened. "Mina," he repeated. "She used to bring me tea and scold me for skipping lunch." The young woman laughed. "That sounds like her. Where, in many, zero." "She was a good friend," he said warmly. "How is she?" The girl's expression faltered slightly. "She passed away last year," she said quietly. David's eyes lowered. "I'm sorry to hear that." "She told me about you," the girl continued. "Before she died, she gave me a letter. She said, 'When you feel lost, go find Mr. Hahn. He knows how to mend more than wood.'" He looked at her gently. "And are you lost?" She smiled faintly, tears glimmering in her eyes. "A little." David nodded, then motioned for her to sit. "Then you're in the right place." For the next hour, they talked. She told him about her mother, how Mina had opened a small bakery, how she'd helped others just like David once did. She spoke about her own struggles, finishing art school, losing her direction after her mother's death, feeling like the world had become too loud, too fast. David listened, patient as always, never interrupting. When she finished, he said softly, "When my father passed, I thought the world had gone silent. But over time, I learned silence isn't absence, it's presence, waiting for you to listen. Your mother's still here, you know. In you. In the people she fed. In every act of kindness she left behind." The girl wiped her eyes, smiling through her tears. "You sound just like she said you would." He chuckled softly. "That's because she was right. Voter the do. We have no the distance stove." Before she left, she noticed the small framed photo on the wall, the one of Mr. Hahn, older, smiling gently at the camera. She pointed to it. "Is that your father?" David nodded. "Yes, everything I am is because of him." She stared at it for a moment, then whispered, "He looks kind." "He was," David said, "the kind of man who could make you feel safe just by being near him. Even now, some days, I talk to him like he's still sitting across from me." The girl smiled. "Then maybe I'll start talking to my mum like that too." "You should," David said. "They never really leave. They just change how they stay." When she walked out, the bell above the door chimed softly again. David watched her go, sunlight wrapping around her as she disappeared down the street. He stood there for a while, feeling the warmth of the day settle into his bones. That evening, after closing the shop, he made a pot of tea. He poured 2 cups as he always did, one for himself, one for the memory that still shared his space. He set the second cup gently across the table, near the photograph. "You see that, Dad?" he said quietly. "People keep coming. People keep healing. I just keep doing what you taught me, one broken thing at a time." The wind outside stirred, carrying the scent of rain. He leaned back in his chair, feeling tired but content. He thought of the years, the mistakes, the redemption, the people who had come and gone, and somewhere deep inside he felt his father's presence again, as warm and steady as the first day he held his hand. He closed his eyes for a moment. The tea grew cold, but he didn't mind. The silence around him was gentle, comforting the silence of a life well lived. When the morning came, the neighbors noticed the shop hadn't opened at its usual hour. They knocked, then quietly stepped inside. David sat in his chair, head tilted slightly, a faint smile on his face. One hand rested on the table, near the empty cup. The sunlight from the window touched his shoulders, soft and golden. There was no fear, no struggle, only peace. That afternoon, the entire town gathered outside Hahn & Son Repairs. The sign still hung proudly above the door, and someone placed a bouquet of wildflowers beneath it. The mayor spoke a few words, but it was the people, the ones David had helped, the ones he'd listened to, who truly told his story. An old man held up a clock that ticked steadily. "He fixed this for me when my wife passed. He told me time would keep moving, even when I couldn't." He was right. A young mother said, He repaired my child's toy and made her smile again. I'll never forget that. And one by one, voices filled the street, stories of kindness, forgiveness, love. As the sun began to set, a boy stepped forward, Leo, now grown, holding a guitar in his hands. He strummed a soft tune, the same melody David had once played for him years ago. The sound drifted into the air, warm and wistful, wrapping around the crowd like an embrace. Above them, the sky glowed with streaks of orange and pink, and for a moment, everyone swore they could feel something, a calm presence, a quiet gratitude, a reminder that love doesn't end, it simply changes form. Days later, the shop reopened, not by chance but by choice. The community decided together to keep it alive. They took turns running it, teaching, repairing, helping each other. The sign still read Han and Son Repairs, though now it stood for something greater, a family that had grown far beyond blood. And every evening, as the lights went out, someone would leave 2 cups of tea on the counter, one for David, one for his father. The tradition continued, just as it always had. In time, people stopped saying, "He fixed things." They said something different. They said, "He taught us how to love through our hands." And so the workshop lived on, small, simple, and full of light. The sound of hammers and laughter carried through the air. The stars shone quietly above. If you passed by at night, you might see that same warm glow in the window, and if you listened closely, you might almost hear a voice, calm, steady, full of love, whispering through the wood and the wind. Nothing is ever too broken to be made whole again.